You don't belong at this table. The words didn't echo, they landed, heavy and deliberate, slicing through the low hum of polished conversations and clinking crystal glasses inside the private dining hall on the 48th floor, where the city of Manhattan stretched beneath floor-to-ceiling windows like a glittering map of power, and for a brief second, everything slowed, every fork paused mid-air, every quiet deal frozen in place. As all eyes turned toward the man they had just dismissed, Ethan Cole stood there in a tailored but understated charcoal suit, no flashy watch, no entourage, no signal to the room that he carried anything more than a quiet presence, and yet there was something about the way he didn't react that made the air shift, like the moment before a storm decides whether to break or pass. Across the table sat the Whitmore family, old money etched into every detail from their posture to the way they didn't bother lowering their voices. Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk, fingers draped over a glass of 12-year bourbon like it belonged to him the same way the skyline did. His daughter Victoria barely concealed her amusement, whispering just loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear, "I mean seriously, who let him in here?" And a few scattered chuckles followed, soft but sharp, the kind that didn't need volume to humiliate. Ethan's gaze moved across the table once, slow, deliberate, not defensive, not offended, just observant, like he was cataloging each voice. Each face, each decision being made in real time. A waiter hesitated nearby, unsure whether to intervene or disappear, and the event coordinator standing near the entrance glanced at her tablet, confusion flickering across her face as she checked the guest list again. Something wasn't adding up, but the Whitmores weren't waiting for confirmation, they had already decided. "This is a closed negotiation," Richard added, his tone turning colder now, more official, as if he were issuing a policy. "Rather than an opinion, we're discussing a $60 billion acquisition, not hosting open seating." Another ripple of restrained laughter followed, and someone at the far end of the table muttered, "Wrong room, man," just loud enough to be heard. Ethan didn't move, didn't defend himself, didn't explain, he simply adjusted his cuff slightly, the smallest gesture, controlled, precise, as if time itself bent around his patience. And in that stillness, something uncomfortable began to grow in the room, not yet fear, not yet doubt, but the faintest crack in certainty. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here." Now, back to Ethan Cole, because while the Whitmores saw a man out of place, what they didn't see, what no one in that room had yet realized, was that Ethan hadn't walked into the wrong room at all. He had walked into a test, and every word they spoke was already tipping the outcome in a direction none of them were prepared for, because power doesn't always announce itself, sometimes it sits quietly at the table, waiting for the moment when silence becomes the loudest answer in the room. The silence did not break immediately, it stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, and in that suspended moment Ethan Cole finally moved, not away from the table, not in retreat, but forward by a single step, subtle enough that most would miss it yet deliberate enough that those watching closely felt it, his eyes lifting to meet Richard Whitmore's without hesitation, not with defiance, not with anger, but with a calm that did not belong to a man out of place. It belonged to someone who understood the room better than anyone else inside it. "I was invited," Ethan said, his voice even, measured, carrying just far enough to reach the edges of the table without rising above it, and that alone shifted something. Because it was not a defense, it was a statement. Victoria let out a soft laugh again, sharper this time. "By who?" she asked, tilting her head as if the answer could only confirm what she already believed. Across the table a few guests exchanged glances, the kind that come when uncertainty begins to creep in. The event coordinator now stepped closer, tablet in hand, her fingers moving quickly across the screen as she scrolled through names, double-checking, triple-checking. Because something about the man standing there did not match the reaction he was receiving. Ethan did not rush to answer, he let the question sit, let it breathe, as if time itself was part of his response. And that pause made the room uneasy in a way no argument could have. Richard leaned forward now, impatience replacing amusement. "This is not a social gathering," he said, his tone tightening. "This is a closed negotiation between vetted parties, so unless you can state exactly who brought you here, I suggest you find the correct floor." A few nods followed, quiet support from those who had already aligned themselves with power. But near the far end of the room a younger associate, barely in his 30s, frowned slightly, his eyes fixed on Ethan as if trying to place something familiar, something just out of reach. Ethan finally spoke again. "The invitation came from the deal itself," he said, "and that answer did not clarify anything, it complicated everything." Victoria frowned, clearly annoyed now. "That is not how invitations work," she replied, her voice losing its earlier playfulness. The coordinator looked up from her tablet, confusion now visible. "Sir, I am not seeing your name listed under the Whitmore Group or any of the confirmed partners," she said carefully, choosing each word as if stepping across a fragile surface. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging her without correcting her, without helping her, because this was no longer about entry, it was about exposure. The room shifted again, conversations at neighboring tables slowed, then stopped entirely, the quiet hum replaced by a tension that felt heavier than before, because now it was not just about one man being out of place. It was about the possibility that the room itself had misunderstood something fundamental. Richard exhaled sharply, leaning back once more as if reclaiming control. "Then that settles it," he said, lifting his glass slightly before setting it back down with a soft but final sound. "You are not part of this negotiation," and this time there was no laughter, only expectation, the kind that waits for compliance, for retreat, for the moment when the outsider accepts his place and leaves. But Ethan did not move, not even an inch, his hands resting calmly at his sides, his posture unchanged, and in that stillness the imbalance grew louder than any voice, because the more the room demanded that he leave, the more it became clear that he had no intention of doing so, and somewhere between the quiet breaths and the unspoken doubts, the first real question began to form in the minds of those watching. Not who he was, but why he was still standing there as if he owned the outcome. The air did not return to normal, it tightened, like the entire room had unknowingly stepped into a space where the rules no longer applied the way they thought they did, and for the first time the attention was no longer on removing Ethan Cole but on understanding why he refused to be moved. The event coordinator shifted her weight slightly, her tablet still in hand but now forgotten, because the absence of his name on the list no longer felt like proof of anything, it felt like a gap, and gaps in rooms like this did not happen by accident. Across the table Victoria crossed her arms, her earlier confidence thinning into irritation. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, her voice sharper now, less composed. "Security should have handled this already." The word security lingered, not as a threat but as an expectation, something that usually followed immediately, efficiently, without question. Yet no one moved, not the staff near the walls, not the manager standing by the entrance. Because something in the room had shifted just enough to make action feel risky. Richard noticed it too, the hesitation, the lack of immediate compliance, and his jaw tightened slightly as he turned his head toward the staff member near the door. "We are not repeating ourselves," he said, calm but firm, the kind of tone that usually closed conversations, but this time it did not land the same way, because Ethan was still there, still composed, still unbothered, and that calm was beginning to feel heavier than authority. Near the far end of the table the younger associate leaned toward another guest and whispered something under his breath, eyes still fixed on Ethan, trying to connect a face to a memory, a name to a reputation. Something was there, something just out of reach. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly across the room, not searching, not scanning, but acknowledging, as if he were aware of every small shift happening in real time. The slowed conversations, the subtle glances, the quiet calculations being made by people who were used to certainty and were now feeling it slip. "You are delaying a $60 billion conversation," Victoria added, her tone now edged with frustration. "Do you understand what that means?" And that question was meant to intimidate. To remind him of scale, of stakes, of the magnitude of what he was interrupting, but Ethan did not react the way she expected. Instead he gave the slightest nod, almost respectful, as if he understood the number far better than anyone else in the room. And that was the moment the imbalance deepened, because the number that was supposed to make him step back seemed to anchor him even more. Richard leaned forward again, slower this time, studying Ethan with a different kind of attention, less dismissal, more scrutiny, as if for the first time he was considering the possibility that this situation was not unfolding by accident. "Then explain it," Richard said, his voice quieter now but more controlled. "Explain why you are here." And the room followed that command, every eye returning to Ethan, every expectation hanging in the space between them, waiting for justification, waiting for a mistake, waiting for something they could use to restore order. but Ethan did not rush, he let the silence stretch once more, because silence here was not weakness, it was pressure, and then finally he spoke, his voice calm, steady, almost conversational, because without me, he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, there is no deal, and this time the silence did not stretch, it dropped, heavy and immediate, like something invisible had just hit the center of the table, and for the first time since he walked in, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one dismissed him. Because whether they believed him or not, the certainty in his voice did something far more dangerous than confrontation, it made them question everything they thought they controlled. The words did not fade, they stayed in the air like a weight no one had prepared to carry, and for the first time the balance in the room did not belong entirely to the Whitmores, it hovered somewhere uncertain, shifting between disbelief and calculation. Richard Whitmore did not respond immediately, which in itself was unusual, because men like him were trained to fill silence with control. But now he studied Ethan Cole with a sharper focus, as if trying to determine whether he was facing arrogance or something far more dangerous. Victoria let out a short breath, almost a scoff, but it lacked the confidence it carried before. That is not how this works, she said, though. The firmness in her tone felt thinner, less grounded, because something about Ethan's certainty refused to bend under pressure. The younger associate at the far end leaned forward slightly now, no longer whispering, his eyes narrowing as recognition finally began to form, not complete, not confirmed, but enough to unsettle him. Wait, he murmured, almost to himself, but the sound carried just enough for the person beside him to hear, and that small reaction rippled quietly, like the first crack in a surface that had always appeared solid. The event coordinator looked down at her tablet again, this time not just scrolling but searching deeper, accessing secondary lists, internal confirmations, anything that might explain what she was missing, because high-level negotiations did not include unknown variables, not at this scale, not at $60 billion, and yet here one stood, completely unmovable. Ethan remained exactly where he was, not asserting dominance, not raising his voice, simply allowing the room to process the possibility that his presence was not an error but a factor, and that possibility was far more disruptive than any argument could have been. Richard finally spoke, slower now, measured. If what you are saying is true, he said, choosing each word carefully as if testing their weight, then you would not be standing here unverified, and that statement was meant to restore order, to pull the conversation back into familiar territory, where proof and structure defined reality. But Ethan's expression did not change, not even slightly. Verification depends on who is checking, he replied, his voice calm, almost quiet, yet it carried with a precision that made it impossible to ignore, and that answer did not challenge authority directly, it exposed its limits. Victoria shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping once against the table before stopping, because the rhythm of control she relied on was slipping. The staff near the entrance exchanged another glance, subtle but telling, because hesitation in rooms like this was rare and never accidental. The younger associate spoke again, louder this time. I have seen him before, he said, not fully confident but no longer silent, and that single sentence did more than any argument. It introduced doubt into a room that thrived on certainty. Richard turned his head slightly toward him, irritation flickering beneath his composed exterior. Then say where, he responded, but the associate hesitated, searching his memory, because recognition without clarity was not enough, and Ethan did not help him, did not confirm or deny, he simply let the moment exist, because the longer the room questioned itself, the less control it had over him. The skyline outside remained unchanged, light stretching endlessly across the city, indifferent to what was unfolding inside, but within those walls something had shifted permanently. The deal was no longer just about numbers, it had become about perception, authority, and the quiet realization that the person they had dismissed might be the only one who truly understood what was at stake, and in that realization, the first real fracture in power began to spread. The fracture did not close, it widened, slow but undeniable, and what had started as quiet doubt now began to take shape in the expressions around the table, subtle shifts in posture, tightened grips on glasses, eyes that no longer dismissed but calculated, because uncertainty at this level was not tolerated, it was investigated. Victoria leaned forward again, this time not with amusement but with something sharper, more defensive. Enough of this, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like an attempt to reclaim control. You are speaking in riddles and wasting everyone's time. Her words were louder now, meant to restore the hierarchy, meant to remind the room who held authority, but the response she expected did not come, because the room was no longer reacting only to her, it was watching him. Ethan Cole did not raise his voice to match hers, he did not interrupt, he simply looked at her, steady, composed, as if her frustration confirmed something rather than challenged it, and that calm made her tone feel louder than it actually was. Richard exhaled slowly, his patience thinning but his control still intact. If you are part of this deal, he said, his voice lower now, more dangerous in its restraint, then you will provide something verifiable, a name, a firm, a position, something real, and that word real carried weight, because it implied that everything Ethan had said so far existed outside their definition of legitimacy. The younger associate shifted again, more certain now, leaning forward with urgency he could no longer suppress. I think he is with Cole Holdings, he said, the words coming out faster than he intended, and that name landed differently, it did not echo like the others. It settled, heavy, recognized by some, questioned by others. Victoria turned sharply toward him, her brows tightening. Cole Holdings is not even at this table, she replied immediately, but there was a slight pause before her words, just enough to suggest she was not entirely sure. The event coordinator froze for a brief second, her eyes flicking back down to her tablet as if that name unlocked a new path of verification, her fingers moving quickly now, deeper into internal systems, restricted lists, executive access levels that were not meant for public view. Ethan did not confirm the statement, did not deny it, he allowed the name to exist in the room like a seed, because he understood something they were only beginning to realize. Recognition was more powerful when it came from others. Richard's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the faintest tightening around his eyes, the smallest shift in posture. Because Cole Holdings was not a small name, it was not a casual reference, it was a force in the kind of deals that reshaped industries, and for the first time the question was no longer whether Ethan belonged in the room, but whether the room had failed to recognize someone they should have known immediately. Victoria tried to recover, her voice sharper now, almost defensive. Even if that were true, she said, this is still a Whitmore-led negotiation, but the words felt less certain, less anchored, because the presence of a name like that introduced variables she could not control. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice calm, almost quiet, yet it carried with a clarity that cut through everything else. Then you should know, he said, pausing just long enough to let every eye settle on him, who decides whether this negotiation exists at all. And that sentence did not raise the volume in the room, it lowered it, because now the tension was no longer built on dismissal, it was built on realization, slow, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. And in that moment the power dynamic did not flip yet, but it shifted just enough that everyone at the table could feel it, like the ground beneath them was no longer as solid as it had been minutes before. The shift in the room did not go unnoticed anymore, it settled into every corner, into every glance, into every second that passed without resolution, and for the first time since the evening began the Whitmores were no longer controlling the pace of the conversation, they were reacting to it. Victoria opened her mouth to respond again but stopped halfway, the words catching somewhere between confidence and doubt, because the name Cole Holdings had changed the equation, not fully, not yet, but enough to make certainty feel dangerous. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly, his fingers no longer relaxed around his glass but still, deliberate, his mind moving faster now, recalibrating, reassessing, because men like him did not survive at this level by ignoring variables. They absorbed them, tested them, and if necessary, neutralized them. Then let us verify that, he said finally, his voice steady again but carrying a new edge, not dismissive, but probing. He turned slightly toward the coordinator, pull every executive registry tied to Cole Holdings. Cross-reference with tonight's attendance. The coordinator nodded quickly, almost relieved to have direction again, her fingers moving faster across the screen. Deeper access, restricted layers, internal confirmations that most people in the room did not even know existed. The tension thickened, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, focused, like the room itself was holding its breath. Ethan Cole remained exactly where he was, not interfering, not rushing the process, because he understood something they were only beginning to grasp. Verification was no longer about proving him wrong, it was about confirming what he already knew. The younger associate leaned closer to the screen from where he sat, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with urgency, his eyes scanning as if the answer was seconds away. Victoria watched the process unfold, her posture stiff, her expression controlled but no longer effortless, because control that requires effort is already slipping. "This is unnecessary," she said. Though her voice lacked the force it had minutes ago, "We are entertaining a distraction," but no one responded, not even her father, because now the distraction had become the focus, and ignoring it would only deepen the risk. The skyline outside remained unchanged, but inside the room everything had narrowed to a single point, a single confirmation that would either restore order or dismantle it completely. The coordinator suddenly paused, her fingers hovering above the screen, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read something twice, then a third time. As if the information in front of her refused to align with the narrative she had been operating under. Richard noticed it immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his tone controlled but sharper now, and she hesitated, not because she did not understand, but because she did, and that understanding carried consequences. "There is a discrepancy," she said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "Cole Holdings is listed as a primary silent stakeholder in this deal." The words landed with weight. "But it was not the end of it," she continued, her voice quieter now, almost cautious, "and the executive authority tied to that stake is not publicly disclosed." The room absorbed that, processed it, recalculated again, because a silent stakeholder at that level did not simply observe, they influenced, they decided, they controlled outcomes from behind the structure everyone else believed they understood. Ethan's presence no longer felt like an interruption. It felt like a missing piece that had just been revealed. Victoria's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, her eyes shifting toward Ethan with something new, not mockery, not irritation, but recognition mixed with unease. Richard's gaze followed, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he were seeing the man in front of him for the first time without assumptions, and Ethan finally moved again, just slightly, a step closer to the table, not invading, not asserting, but positioning himself exactly where he had always intended to be, and in that moment the room understood something fundamental. The negotiation they believed they controlled had never been entirely theirs, and the man they tried to remove was not outside the deal, he was at its core. The room did not recover from that revelation, it reorganized itself around it, like every person present had been forced to adjust their understanding in real time, and the confidence that once filled the space now felt thinner, more fragile, because control built on incomplete information does not hold for long. Richard Whitmore did not speak immediately, but the silence he held now was different from before. It was no longer dismissive, it was analytical, his eyes fixed on Ethan Cole with a level of attention that acknowledged risk, not inconvenience. Victoria shifted in her seat, her posture no longer relaxed, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding herself in something solid. "That still does not explain who you are," she said, her voice controlled but edged with urgency. Because the room needed clarity, needed something definitive to hold on to. The coordinator glanced up again, hesitation clear in her expression. "The system does not show a public executive profile," she added, almost apologetically, "only a private authority clearance tied to the stake," and that detail did not simplify the situation, it deepened it, because private authority at that level was not given lightly. It was assigned to individuals who operated beyond visibility, beyond standard verification. Ethan let the information settle, did not rush to claim it, did not rush to correct it, because the room was arriving at the truth on its own, and that made it stronger. The younger associate leaned forward again, more certain now. "Cole Holdings does not move without executive sign-off," he said, his voice steady but tense, "and whoever holds that authority decides everything." The implication hung clearly now, no longer hidden, no longer abstract. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition, because he understood the weight of what was being suggested, and more importantly, the cost of being wrong about it. "Then let us be precise," he said slowly, his tone measured. "Are you claiming to represent that authority?" The question was direct, controlled, designed to force a clear answer, to either confirm or dismantle the growing assumption. The entire table focused on Ethan now, not with dismissal, not even with skepticism, but with anticipation, because the answer would redefine the entire room. Ethan finally moved his hands, resting them lightly on the back of the chair in front of him, not taking a seat, not fully joining, but anchoring himself in the space between outsider and decision-maker, his gaze steady, unwavering. I am not representing it, he said, his voice calm, almost quiet, and for a split second the room leaned toward relief. Toward the idea that this tension could resolve itself, that control could return, but then he continued, without raising his tone, without changing his expression, I am it, and that was the moment everything shifted completely, not in volume, not in chaos, but in certainty, because the ambiguity that had protected assumptions was gone, replaced by a statement that left no room for interpretation. Victoria's composure broke just enough to show it. Her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before she regained control. Richard did not react outwardly, but the stillness in his posture spoke louder than any response, because men like him recognize truth not by emotion but by pattern, by presence, by the way someone carried a room without asking for permission. The staff near the entrance no longer looked uncertain, they looked alert, aware that the hierarchy had just changed, and Ethan did not follow his statement with explanation, did not defend it, did not justify it. Because real authority does not argue for itself, it waits for the room to catch up, and in that silence, heavier than anything before, the Whitmores and everyone around them realized that the man they had tried to remove was not just part of the deal, he was the one holding it together, and whether they accepted it or not, everything that happened next would move through him. The words did not echo, they settled, deep and irreversible, and for a moment the room did not react because it could not, it had reached the edge of its own assumptions and found nothing to stand on. Ethan Cole did not move after he said it, he did not repeat it, did not reinforce it, he simply allowed it to exist, and that restraint made it impossible to dismiss. Because people could argue with noise but not with certainty delivered in silence, Victoria's eyes lingered on him longer now. Searching, recalculating, as if trying to reconstruct every second since he walked in, every word she had said, every laugh she had allowed, and for the first time the weight of those moments began to register, not as social missteps, but as decisions with consequences. Richard Whitmore leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, not defensively, but with the focus of someone who finally understood the stakes had shifted beyond perception. His voice when it came was lower, controlled, but no longer dismissive. If that is true, he said, then you chose to walk into this room without identification, without announcement, without structure. It was not a denial, it was an accusation framed as logic, an attempt to re-establish ground, to suggest that even if Ethan held authority, his approach had been improper. But Ethan's expression did not change, because that argument relied on rules he had never agreed to. The younger associate leaned back slowly, the realization now complete in his eyes, recognition settling into something heavier, something that carried memory. He does this, he said quietly, not to challenge, but to confirm. I have seen articles, interviews, stories. He walks in without warning, watches how people respond when they think he does not matter, and that sentence changed the tone again, because it reframed everything that had happened, not as a misunderstanding, but as a test, intentional, deliberate, unavoidable. The coordinator lowered her tablet slightly, no longer searching, because the answer she needed was already in front of her, and the system she trusted had only confirmed what it could not fully display. Victoria exhaled slowly, her composure returning but altered, sharper, more guarded. So this was intentional, she said, her voice steady now but edged with something else, something closer to frustration than confidence. You let this happen. Ethan finally shifted his gaze directly to her, not confrontational, not cold, but clear. No, he said, his voice even. I allowed you to decide how it would happen, and that distinction landed with precision, because it removed blame from circumstance and placed it directly on choice. The room absorbed that in silence, because there was no easy response, no way to redirect it without acknowledging what had already been done. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, a small movement but deliberate, as if marking the shift from one phase of the negotiation to another. Then let us be clear about something, he said, his tone now fully controlled again, but no longer dominant. This deal was built on structure, on mutual interest, on defined roles, and he paused, just long enough to reassert his presence in the conversation. And if you are what you claim to be, then we proceed accordingly. It was not an apology, not yet, but it was the first step away from dismissal, the first acknowledgement that Ethan was no longer outside the deal, he was inside it, at its center. Ethan gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in recognition of the shift, because this was the moment he had been waiting for, not the reveal, not the reaction, but the recalibration. when the room finally understood that power did not need to introduce itself, it only needed to be recognized, and now that it was, everything that followed would no longer be based on assumption, it would be based on consequence, and the weight of those consequences had only just begun to unfold. The recalibration did not restore comfort, it exposed something deeper, something far less controlled than the Whitmores were used to managing, because now every word carried weight, every silence carried consequence, and Ethan Cole did not rush to fill either. He simply reached into his jacket with a calm, unhurried motion and pulled out his phone, not dramatically, not as a threat, but as a continuation of something already in motion. And that simple action drew every eye again, because in a room like this devices did not interrupt conversations, they directed them. Richard watched closely, his expression steady but alert, because he understood that whatever came next would not be symbolic, it would be structural. "You mentioned proceeding accordingly," Ethan said, his voice even, his attention still on the screen as he unlocked it. "That requires alignment." The word alignment landed differently now, not as negotiation language, but as authority setting terms. Victoria leaned slightly forward, her focus locked on him, no longer dismissing, no longer interrupting, because instinct had shifted into caution. Ethan tapped once, then again, precise, deliberate, and then lifted the phone slightly toward his ear, not for performance, but for execution. "This is Cole," he said, his tone unchanged, direct, without introduction, without clarification, because the person on the other end did not need either. A brief pause followed, not empty, but active, like something larger than the room had just been engaged. "Initiate clause 17, he continued, his voice carrying just enough for the table to hear. "Suspend all active movement on the Whitmore acquisition." The sentence did not rise, did not escalate, but it landed with a force that shifted the room instantly. Victoria's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly as the words processed. Not fully, not yet, but enough to signal disruption. Richard's gaze sharpened, not reacting outwardly, but calculating at a level deeper than before, because clause 17 was not casual language, it was contractual, embedded, and irreversible. Once triggered, the younger associate looked between them, recognition now mixed with urgency. "That clause pauses liquidity alignment," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough to ripple across the table. "Nothing moves without clearance after that." The implication spread quickly, because a paused deal at this scale did not simply wait, it destabilized. Ethan remained still, listening for a moment before speaking again into the phone. "Confirm execution." Another pause, shorter this time, and then a faint nod, almost imperceptible. "Understood," he said, before lowering the phone and returning it to his pocket with the same calm precision, as if he had just adjusted a minor detail rather than altered the trajectory of $60 billion. The silence that followed was not uncertain anymore, it was heavy, grounded in reality, because what had been theoretical moments ago was now active, real, unfolding beyond the walls of the room. Victoria broke first, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a controlled urgency that betrayed the shift. "You cannot make that call unilaterally," she said, her voice steady but tightened, because control demanded resistance, even when certainty was gone. Ethan looked at her, not dismissive, not aggressive, but clear. "I just did," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer removed any space for argument. Richard did not interrupt this time, did not counter immediately, because he understood something critical. The deal was no longer a negotiation, it was a decision point, and that decision no longer belonged entirely to him. The skyline outside remained unchanged, but inside the room the structure they had relied on was already shifting, already responding to a command that did not require approval, only authority, and for the first time since the evening began, the Whitmores were no longer determining the outcome, they were reacting to it, in real time, under pressure, with consequences already in motion. The impact of the call did not arrive all at once, it moved through the room in layers, subtle at first, then undeniable, like a system recalibrating far beyond what anyone present could see. And the first sign was not a voice, not a reaction, but a vibration, low and sharp, as one phone lit up, then another, then several more across the table, screens flashing with incoming alerts, messages marked urgent, subject lines that carried weight even before they were opened. The younger associate checked his device instinctively, his expression shifting as he read, eyes narrowing, posture tightening. "Liquidity channels are frozen," he said under his breath, but the words carried, because the room was already listening for confirmation. Victoria reached for her phone next, faster this time, no hesitation, her eyes scanning quickly, once, then again, as if hoping the message would change on a second read, but it did not. Her composure held, but only just, because this was no longer theoretical, this was operational. Richard Whitmore did not check his phone immediately, and that choice alone revealed everything about his experience, because men at his level did not react to noise, they waited for patterns, for confirmation, for the moment when denial was no longer efficient, and when he finally did glance down, it was brief, controlled, but enough for the smallest shift in his posture, the slightest tightening in his jaw, the kind that did not need words to communicate its meaning. The coordinator stepped back slightly now, no longer part of the process, because the process had moved beyond her, beyond the room, into systems that responded only to authority, and Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, unaffected by the wave he had set in motion, his stillness now carrying a different weight, not quiet confidence, but confirmed control. Victoria looked up from her phone, her voice steady but sharper now, no longer dismissive, no longer mocking. "You paused the deal," she said, and the sentence was not a question, it was a realization. Ethan met her gaze calmly. "No," he replied, his tone even, precise. "I gave it a chance to be corrected," and that distinction landed with more force than any accusation could have, because it reframed the situation entirely. This was not retaliation, this was consequence with an opening. Richard placed his phone face down on the table, slowly, deliberately, his eyes lifting back to Ethan, not with anger, not even with frustration, but with something far more controlled, something closer to acknowledgement. "Then let us correct it," he said, and the words were measured, intentional, because this was the first real shift in position, not resistance, not dominance, but negotiation under new terms. The room felt it immediately, the pivot from control to adaptation. Victoria glanced at him briefly, surprised, not by the words themselves, but by the speed at which he adjusted. Because in rooms like this survival depended on knowing when power had shifted and responding before it became collapse. Ethan did not respond right away, he allowed the offer to sit, to settle, because timing mattered, because reaction without reflection weakened leverage, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, grounded, unmistakably clear. "Correction starts with recognition," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the table, not accusing, not searching, but acknowledging every person who had contributed to the moment that brought them here. "You did not misread the deal," he continued, "you misjudged the person behind it," and that sentence did not raise the tension, it clarified it, because now the issue was no longer procedural, it was personal, rooted in perception, in assumption, in the decisions made before facts were considered. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was reflective, heavy with the understanding that what had been dismissed as a simple removal had turned into something far more costly. And Ethan did not need to raise his voice, did not need to demand anything further, because the structure of the room had already changed, and everyone inside it knew that whatever came next would not be driven by who spoke the loudest, but by who held the power to decide when everything moved again. The silence after his words did not invite immediate response, it demanded reflection, and for the first time that night the room was no longer reacting out of instinct or ego, it was thinking, recalculating every step that had led to this moment, every assumption that had been made without verification, every word that had been spoken without consequence until now. Victoria lowered her phone slowly onto the table, her posture no longer rigid but controlled in a different way, less about dominance, more about awareness, because the cost of misreading the situation had already begun to materialize beyond the walls of the room. Richard Whitmore did not rush to fill the space either, his hands resting calmly in front of him, his gaze steady on Ethan Cole, but no longer measuring him as an unknown variable, instead assessing him as a deciding force, a shift that did not happen often and never lightly. "Recognition," Richard repeated quietly, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement of the term Ethan had placed on the table, and the word carried weight now, because it was no longer abstract, it was specific, it required action, not just agreement. Victoria glanced briefly toward her father, then back at Ethan, and when she spoke again her tone had changed, not softened, but sharpened in a different direction, precise, deliberate. "Then let us be clear," she said, her voice steady. "What exactly are you asking for?" And that question marked a turning point. Because it was no longer about removing him, or questioning him, it was about understanding what it would take to move forward. Ethan did not answer immediately, he let the question settle, because timing was still part of control, and when he spoke, it was not louder, not more forceful, just clearer. "I am not asking for anything," he said, and that alone shifted the dynamic again, because requests could be negotiated. But absence of request meant something else entirely. "I am observing whether you understand what already happened," he continued, his gaze moving briefly across the table, acknowledging not just the Whitmores, but everyone who had been part of the earlier exchange, the laughter, the dismissal, the quiet agreement that had followed it. The room absorbed that, and the weight of it was different now, heavier, because it was no longer about fixing a deal, it was about addressing a failure in judgment. The younger associate shifted in his seat, no longer trying to identify Ethan, but processing the implications of what had already been set in motion. The coordinator stood still, her tablet lowered, because her role had been replaced by something far less technical and far more human. Richard finally leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, controlled, but carrying something new, something that had not been present before. "Then let us acknowledge it," he said, and the words were deliberate, chosen carefully. Because acknowledgement at this level was not casual, it was strategic, it was necessary. Victoria followed his lead, not immediately, but with intention, her eyes meeting Ethan's directly now, not searching, not doubting, but recognizing. "We misjudged you," she said, the sentence simple, direct, without decoration, and that simplicity made it heavier, because it did not attempt to soften what had been done. Ethan did not respond right away, he let the acknowledgement exist, because validation was not the goal, clarity was, and in that moment the room understood something that had not been clear before. This was never about a single comment or a single moment, it was about a pattern, a way of seeing, a way of deciding who belonged and who did not before facts were even considered, and Ethan's presence had exposed that pattern without raising his voice, without demanding attention, simply by refusing to move. The skyline outside remained unchanged, but inside the room something fundamental had shifted, not just in the structure of the deal, but in the awareness of the people negotiating it, and that awareness carried consequences that extended far beyond $60 billion, because once recognition happens at this level, it does not disappear, it stays, shaping every decision that follows. The acknowledgement did not dissolve the tension, it clarified it, and clarity at this level did not always lead to resolution, sometimes it led to consequence, and Ethan Cole stood in that space without urgency, without the need to respond immediately, because the room had finally arrived where it needed to be, not at agreement, but at awareness, and awareness was the point where decisions became irreversible. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly, his posture composed but no longer anchored in control, his mind already moving through outcomes, contingencies, reputational cost, financial exposure, because a paused deal at this scale was not just a delay, it was a signal to markets, to competitors, to partners who were watching from a distance, and signals like that did not stay quiet for long. Victoria exhaled once, steadying herself, her earlier confidence now replaced with something more calculated, more careful, because she understood the gravity of what had been set in motion, not just by the clause, but by the moment that triggered it. "Then the correction has been made," she said, her tone controlled, deliberate, as if framing the situation in a way that could still be recovered. "We acknowledged it," but even as she said it, the limitation of that statement was clear. Acknowledgement addressed the moment, not the pattern, and Ethan's gaze reflected that understanding without needing to challenge it directly. He stepped forward slightly now, not into the seat, not fully into the circle, but just enough to shift the geometry of the room, to make it clear that his presence was no longer conditional, it was central. "Acknowledgement is the beginning," he said, his voice even, carrying the same calm authority that had defined every word he spoke, not the resolution, and that distinction mattered, because it removed the illusion that a single sentence could restore what had already been disrupted. The younger associate lowered his eyes briefly, processing the implications, because this was no longer just about one deal, it was about how decisions were made in rooms like this, who was seen, who was dismissed, and what that cost when the assumptions were wrong. Richard leaned forward again, slower this time. His voice measured, deliberate. "Then what defines resolution?" he asked, and the question was no longer defensive, it was strategic, because understanding the path forward was now essential. not optional. Ethan held his gaze for a moment before responding, allowing the weight of the question to settle, because resolution at this level was not a checklist, it was a shift in standard, consistency, he said finally. One word, but it carried more weight than a longer explanation, not just here. Not just now, but in every decision that follows. The room absorbed that in silence, because consistency could not be performed in a single moment, it had to be proven over time, and that meant the cost of failure extended beyond tonight, beyond this table, into every future interaction, every unseen decision where perception might once again replace verification. Victoria nodded once, slowly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition of what was being required, because this was no longer about saving a deal, it was about redefining how they operated. Richard did not nod, did not verbally agree, but the stillness in his posture shifted again, not in resistance, but in acceptance of the reality in front of him, and Ethan, having said what needed to be said, did not add more, did not press further, because real leverage does not repeat itself, it holds, it waits. It allows others to decide how they will respond, and in that moment the room understood that the outcome was no longer controlled by negotiation alone, it was shaped by what they chose to do next, not just for the deal, but for everything that would follow after it. The room did not move forward immediately, because what had been said did not require an instant response, it required a decision, and decisions at this level were never rushed, they were measured against consequence, against reputation, against the invisible cost of being wrong in front of the wrong person. Ethan Cole stood in that stillness without shifting his posture, without pressing for an answer, because he already understood something the room was only beginning to accept, that power did not need agreement to exist, it only needed recognition, and once that recognition happened, everything else became optional. Richard Whitmore finally exhaled, slow and controlled, his eyes steady on Ethan, not with resistance, not with pride, but with clarity, the kind that comes when a man realizes the structure he thought he controlled was never fully his to begin with. Then we will adjust, he said, his voice calm, deliberate, not loud, not defensive, just precise, and that sentence carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it was not an attempt to reclaim control, it was an acceptance that control had already shifted. Victoria did not speak immediately after him, but her posture reflected the same understanding, her earlier sharpness replaced by something more calculated, more aware, because the cost of repeating the same mistake was no longer abstract, it had already been demonstrated in real time. The younger associate sat back slowly, no longer searching for answers, because the answer had been standing in front of him the entire time, and now it was undeniable. The coordinator remained still, her role complete, her system no longer needed, because the final decision would not come from data, it would come from judgment. Ethan let the moment settle, not as a victory, not as a performance, but as a confirmation of what had already been established, and then, finally, he moved, not dramatically, not abruptly, just a single step back from the table, creating space again, the same space he had occupied when he first walked in, but now it meant something entirely different. Now it was not distance, it was control. Good, he said, his voice even, steady, carrying the same calm that had defined every word from the beginning. Because nothing I did tonight was personal, and that statement reframed everything once more, removing emotion from the equation and replacing it with principle. It was structural, he continued, his gaze moving across the table one last time, not accusing, not searching, but acknowledging, and structures only work when the people inside them do. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of understanding, of recalibration, of the quiet realization that this moment would not stay in this room, it would follow them, shape them, define the way they moved forward whether they chose to admit it or not. Ethan reached for his phone again, not to make another call, not to escalate, but simply to check, a brief glance, a small confirmation, and then he slipped it back into his pocket, the action simple, controlled, final. The deal is still paused, he added, his tone unchanged. What happens next depends on you, and with that he turned, not waiting for approval, not waiting for response, because he did not need either, and as he walked toward the exit the room did not stop him, did not call after him, did not attempt to regain what had already shifted, they simply watched, because they understood now that what they had witnessed was not just a moment, it was a standard. And standards do not need to stay in a room to have impact, they carry forward, into every decision, every interaction, every assumption that would now be questioned before it was made, and as the door closed behind him, the skyline still stretched endlessly outside, unchanged, but inside, something fundamental had been rewritten, not by force, not by volume, but by presence, by patience, and by the quiet certainty of a man who never needed to prove he belonged, because he was the reason the room existed in the first place.